Growing up evangelical, as many of you have, I participated in what is called Vacation Bible School. How many of you ever been to a Vacation Bible School? Yep. How many of you ever been to therapy? Okay. I went to Vacation Bible. First of all, I have amazing memories about Vacation Bible School. They're some of my favorite times growing up. It was the apex, and you grew up in a small town like I did. There wasn't a lot of things to do, and so when you told me there was a Vacation Bible School, that was like a big deal. And so I grew up going to them. Obviously, my father was a Southern Baptist pastor, and so I've been to plenty of them and put on plenty of them and been a part of that. But there was one particular one that I went to when I was 9. We lived in a little town called Webb, Alabama, right outside of Dothan, Alabama. My dad pastored a church there called Poplar Springs Baptist Church. It's no longer a church. It's boarded up now. Didn't make it. But at the time, it was like a thriving space. And my dad was there, and they hosted like the town's Vacation Bible School. And I went, and we did the whole thing. So the way Vacation Bible Schools work, at least how I grew up, was they were so much fun, and that's how they attracted all the neighborhood kids. They also attracted all the neighborhood kids because parents were like free daycare, and so they would drop their kids off, which I'm told is still a thing. It's an actual circuit where people drop their kids off at different VBSs. That's something, all right? Can't wait to see how that pans out for those kids when they become adults. But we would have Vacation Bible School, and the way Vacation Bible School worked is you had all these fun parts to it. So we had on the last day we would all go swimming, homemade vanilla ice cream. They had arts and crafts stations. Every day we did arts and crafts. And then we had all kinds of snacks. Like that was a big deal growing up. But to get to all of that, you had to go through the service. So they basically had like a little service for all the people who attended Vacation Bible School. And in that service, it opened exactly the same. You'd carry the flags down. And so they would pick a kid to carry the flag down. We had the American flag, the Christian flag, and then someone would carry the Bible, all right? And that was usually me. Should have known. You know what I mean? Should have known back then I was going to become some spiritual leader because they had me carrying the Bible. And I carried the Bible, and I always thought you had the American flag and the Christian flag, but the most powerful one was the Bible. You know what I'm talking about? Like that puts all those to shame. Inevitably, they would pledge allegiance to the American flag first because we were good Christian nationalists. And so it was like American flag and then Christian flag and then the Bible, all right? And then you would sit, and someone would get up and they would give a lesson, a Bible lesson. And one particular moment at 9 years old in Webb, Alabama, someone gave the Bible lesson. I'm not sure what they said, couldn't tell you. All I know is this. I got up out of my seat at the end of it. I came down forward. One of the nice, sweet ladies that was working Vacation Bible School said, "Oh, it's the pastor's son, Cody." She took my hand and she said, "What's going on?" And I looked up at her and said, "I need to be saved." And immediately, like, shock comes over her because I think she assumed because I was a pastor's kid, I was just born saved. You know what I'm talking about? But she was like, "Oh, the pastor's kid wants to be saved." And so they basically kind of went through this thing. Here's what you need to do. And they gave me 3 letters: admit, believe, confess. They called it the ABCs of salvation. How many of you have ever heard this before? Anybody? Yeah. All right. And here's what's so interesting. To get to the salvation, they told me I didn't have to do anything, but then they told me I had to do something, which was really confusing as a child. They're like, "Oh, no, Jesus paid it all, but you need to do these things." So which one is it, evangelicals? Do we not do something because it's been done, or has it been done, but yet we still have to do something, right? And then it was always interesting, like, no, but it's like a gift. They would use this metaphor. You have to receive it, all right? Oh, so you do have to do something, is what you're saying. So whatever happened in the work of Jesus wasn't quite enough. We're going to need to add on a little something. We're going to need to take it, accept it, receive it. So we do have to do something. Well, their first step was, yeah, of course you do. The first step you need to do is admit that you are a sinner. Now, if you were here on the first week, I broke this out and everyone was triggered, so I put it back up. Because many of you know, somebody called it the salvation square, which is my new phrase for it, but it's actually called the evangelical. Do you know, you've probably heard of this. This is the evangelical. So it has all these little stages, and it breaks down, and you could, like, share, they would tell us to share the gospel with the evangelical. And you could just flip it, and it has the story, well, I would argue not the story, the evangelical story is what it has. And step one is this man that's dark and red and then the divine over here. And the idea is that step one, you have to admit that you are a sinner, that you are broken, that you are inherently flawed, and because of your nature, you are separated from the divine. So at 9 years old, I did what a good 9-year-old would do. I followed instructions, and they said, if you want to be saved, here's what you need to do. So I stood at Vacation Bible School with a sea of my friends, and I made my first public declaration about who I was at 9. And I said to my friends, hi, my name is Cody, and I am a sinner. I am broken, and I am inherently flawed. I said that at 9 years old. My first conscious perception of who I was that I was inherently born broken. Now, evangelicals call that original sin. I call it the ultimate childhood wound. Now, if you're here and you're like, what is original sin? Let's just start here, okay? Let's start with a working definition of original sin for just a minute. Here's what original sin is. Original sin is the doctrine that states all humans are born inherently broken and separated from God. It is the doctrine that teaches that sin is passed down biologically. And so in essence, babies, if you're here and you've just had an infant, and you look at that infant, you're like, how sweet. Well, if you believe in original sin, you would go, how depraved. This child, born inherently broken. All right? Now, that's original sin. What has happened in my life, and this is where we're going today, is there's been a shift from original sin to realizing that the evangelical starting place, this one idea, this one belief of original sin has done more damage to the human species than arguably the doctrine of hell ever has. And what you have in an evangelical business model is you have two of the most egregious ideas come together. A starting point and an ending point. And one of the reasons evangelicals don't like Genesis 1, which we're going to get to, is because it removes, by and large, their entire plan. And when you remove that, you start to ask questions, then why are we here? Why are we doing this? What is it all about? And so you have a bookend. One is, you were born inherently broken. You're flawed. You're a sinner. That's you. That's your nature. You didn't really have a choice in it. Original sin says it was passed on to you. Just passed on to you. You didn't have a choice. It's always interesting to me growing up in the church, they talked a lot about free will, but I was like, I don't think I had free will in my sin because you told me I was just born this way. So I didn't choose. I didn't choose who my parents were. I also didn't choose that I was a sinner. I was just born that way, right? So that's starting place. And then their ending place, as if that isn't more amazing, is, oh, and by the way, you're going to burn for all of eternity. Now that's good news. But the good news is we have the answer and we have the solution. And here's the thing. To get it, though, you need to come to us. And we're going to give it to you, but it's going to cost you something, right? Now, I have now, since after years of therapy, uncovered within my own internal world that nothing has affected my own self-perception more than the religion that formed it many years ago. And I have concluded that much of my own wounds that I am working through in my life currently, much of my own diagnosis of even having a panic disorder, much of that, as I uncovered, not all of it, I'm not putting blame on something else because I certainly chose some things, but much of it, as I uncover layers and layers and layers of grief, what I have discovered is an inner child within me, and that inner child within me happens to be 9 years old and happens to be the very child who stood and made his first public declaration that there's something wrong with him. And I can't begin to tell you the ramifications of that being a starting place. That every child that has ever heard that idea, every child that has ever voiced that declaration, has had the psychological damage of living with something that is so far from anything even the writers of the text are actually saying. And so today and next Sunday, I'd like to get into that a little bit, all right? A couple things. When you talk about original sin, you might ask the question, where did that come from? Now, that's what I want to talk about today a little bit. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, and then we're going to do a slam dunk at the end and, make tweets. You know what I'm talking about? All right? So that's where we're going today. Next week, I want to really zero in and methodically walk through one of the proof texts that evangelicals use for original sin, all right? We're going to get into it today a little bit, but I'm just going to ask a couple questions and play on the image at the very beginning of the story. But then next week, we'll really walk through methodically what I think is actually happening in one of their major proof texts, all right? Now, all of that said, you may ask, where does this idea come from? So likely, if you grew up in church, your parents probably taught you that, right? You probably were handed this idea. Admit that you were a sinner, all right? Yes, you were born broken. All right? Maybe some of you are here and you're like, I still believe that. It's my hope that I can shift that for you, all right? I don't tell you a lot of times what you need to believe, and you believe whatever you want, and I don't oftentimes work to change beliefs, but I want to be very clear today, I am, all right? Because I happen to believe it's the most damaging idea that the human species has ever embraced, all right? And we're going to get into that in a minute because I got one line that I want to throw at you, all right? Now, all of that said, I want to talk a little bit about one of their major proof texts. Now, there's typically 3 proof texts when you talk about original sin. One is found in Romans 5, which is Paul. It's one of the authentic letters of Paul that we have. So you can find that there. We'll talk about that on Easter, actually, in 2 weeks. Easter is in 2 weeks, people. All right, so we'll talk about Romans 5. One is Psalm 51, which is David when he says, I was conceived in sin. There's 1,000 ways to understand that and interpret that. It's not original sin, all right? The other is the big one. Now, this is the ultimate proof text of evangelicals, all right? And it's the text that I swear it seems they love the most. It's Genesis chapter 3. Have you heard this story before, right? Maybe you have. It's a story about Adam and Eve, all right? And it's a story about them being lied to. And as they were lied to, they take the fruit, which I was told was an apple. Turns out it wasn't. We don't know what it was, all right? They take the fruit, and then they disobey the divine voice, and sin happened. Now, I want to get into that story and ask a couple questions, but we'll really jump into it next week. Now, to get there, a little bit of context would be helpful, all right? The Israelites, this group of people, had 2 creation narratives, at least 2 that they wrote down. Now, there were many creation narratives in that particular part of the world in the ancient Near East during that time. And the ancient Near East had loads of creation narratives. You can read Enuma Elish, and it will tell you about the Babylonian creation narrative, how the world came to be, the gods came together and fought each other. Marduk and Tiamat come together, and then the earth was created out of that. Remember, the Israelites are living in Babylon, so they're very familiar with the Babylonian creation story, all right? And they decide, living in Babylon in exile, hey, that's not our story. That's the Babylonian creation story. We as the Israelites, we need our own story. And so they start writing their own creation narratives. And they wrote one, which was older, and then they wrote another, and both are actually combined in a lot of the Bibles that you carry, all right? So the first one is found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. You're probably familiar with this. It opens up like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this is from a particular different group of people who are writing around the 6th century. This is like a post-exilic, post-destruction of the temple. This is them in Babylon in exile, and they're writing, trying to make sense of their own story. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. When you're living in exile, you don't know who you are. You've lost your identity. And they come together going, how do we know our people? And so they start editing and collecting stories. Circumcision was one way. They're like, that's our identity. We know that. The other one was we can keep practicing the Passover. That'll tell people who we are. But what if we collected stories together? And so they did. But then there's another creation narrative. It's found in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And it reads like this. Instead of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 2:4 says, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And what scholarship tells us is these are actually two completely different creation accounts. Roughly one was written during the exile. The other was written much earlier, between the 9th and 10th century. But what they've realized is it was redacted by an editor much later, even after the exile. And that's when the Pentateuch comes together, the Torah comes together, roughly somewhere after 539 BCE. And what I want to read today is the second creation account. I just want to read a portion of it. So it actually starts in Genesis 2, but we'll pick up in Genesis 3. Now, a couple things you need to know about this story before we get into this. This story is not unlike all the other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives. It's poetry. It's mythos. I don't know how to tell you this other than, again, I'm not interested in are things literal, are they not literal. I'm more interested in what do these stories mean. But I will tell you, it's really challenging when you are, and maybe you've bumped up against this before, but when you come from a very conservative evangelical space and you were taught as a kid, Adam and Eve were a real person, right? Real people, literal people, and this is how the earth was created. And then you go off to the university, and I remember our parents would always get real nervous. They were like, you better believe, they sent me to Liberty University because they said, you're going to be at a Christian university. You know what I'm talking about? You ever noticed how scared, the evangelical were like, oh, it's a dangerous world out there, all right? And now I realize, now that I have drank the Kool-Aid from the secular university, I realize what they were afraid of. You know what I mean? Because I drank it, and then it took me. You know what I'm talking about? And it's so interesting because, I remember early on going, we were anti-science growing up. As an evangelical, we were against it. I remember the first time I heard about this concept of evolution. Even that word was dirty to me. When we first started Vinings Lake and I got up, when I first became the pastor, I did a whole series and it was called Evolve. And a whole group of people got up and walked out and they're like, just heresy. And I remember just trying to reach out to them going, wait, growth is heresy? And then it dawned on me, yes, to them it is, all right? But it was just the word, evolve. It's like evolution. What is this Darwinism you're teaching? Get back to the Bible, young man. And I remember there's like a conflict between science and religion. And of course, we walked through this during the Age of Enlightenment, right? This is just us as a culture. And there was a battle, and it's like, what do you do? Wait a minute. So is the earth 6,000 years old, or is it not 6,000? And all of those conversations happened when I was young and in college. And I remember even early on going, I just don't know if that's even the point of these stories. Because I never found it that interesting. I remember going to chapel services at our university and watching secular scientists and Christian biblicists debate each other. And I would always just yawn so boring. I don't actually, and how would anyone even know? Doesn't matter to me. I was far more interested in what do these stories even mean? And why would they write them? And why did they collect them? And so what happens in this particular story is I think it's helpful for you to know when you read it that it's okay. It's okay. I know for some of you, you're so far beyond this that right now you're going, can you move on with the good stuff? Because you're like, I don't even think of the Bible that way anymore, right? But there are people in this room that do. And remember, you evolved enlightened folks. Don't forget where you came from, all right? It was interesting to me, people that get evolved, all of a sudden they start turning their nose up at people that aren't evolved. And then I would say to you, you're probably not as evolved as you think you are if you're turning your nose up at people that aren't evolved. I'm out. You know what I'm saying, right? Maybe all you got was more information, but you've really never had transformation. Yeah, that's a play on words, old pastor move. It's a tweet. Okay. I'm saying to you, if you're here and you're still wrestling with literalism in the text. Can I give you permission? Can I tell you I love the Bible so much more now than I ever have? Because I realized at some point it just isn't living up to what they said it was. And when I let that thing go and I'm like, oh my God, what an amazing group of stories that we have here. They're amazing. And they are transformative. We did a whole series on the Bible, but I just want to give you permission. Here's your permission slip. It's okay. It's okay to read this literally, not literally. All right? And literally means there's a talking snake. Okay? So if you're here and you're like, so how does that work? Literally, it's a myth. It's mythos. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. Again, I'll go back to Marcus Borg. The Bible is true, and some of it actually happened. All right? So when you read this story, it's just good to know this is poetry. It's mythos. You have talking animals. That's the first sign that the writer's like, hey, just a heads up, this is like Shrek version. You know what I'm talking about? You've never watched Shrek and you're like, so how did that work exactly? Like how did the ogre actually, you know what I mean? Like that is a Western rational university seminary graduate, if I've ever met one, looking at Shrek going, so like exactly, can you break it down of how that works? No, you would say, what are you talking? You've missed the whole point of Shrek. You've missed the entire point of him. That's not what it's about. This is like when I meet people that I will let them. I love. There's parts of me that loves music, and like, have you heard this song? And then when I pass it to someone who like deconstructs it technically, I'm like, gross. What, you're ruining the vibe. You know what I'm talking about? Feel the vibe, man. You gotta let it move you. Don't be like, well, technically, like, no. You're already up here. You gotta push that baby down in here. You don't dissect music intellectually. Man, you let that thing move you to when you're in the car, you start swaying back and forth. What is that? That's myth. That's poetry. That's like heart level stuff. Do you know what I'm talking about? And that's the shift that happened to me with the Bible. I used to read it from like a theological, I was like, oh, I got to make sense of all of this. And then it was like, what? Then all of a sudden it just, when I released that and I was like, maybe it is all myth. All of a sudden it's like, oh, and that's when, man, it took me. And I read it more now. I sound so conservative, and I'm okay with that. I read the Bible more now than I ever have in my life. And that goes out, Mom and Dad, if you're listening. I read the Bible more now than I've ever. People, you ever go to Vinings Lake? Now, we're riffing now, but hang on. You go to Vinings Lake. We ain't even got to the talk. You go to Vinings Lake, and people are like, has your parents ever said to you because you go to church, I'm just a little concerned? I'm a little concerned. One time as a leadership team, I pushed it because I wanted to do it, but there's a billboard at the corner of South Cobb and East West. You ever seen it before? It's like one of the electronic. I was like, find out how much that billboard's going to cost. I was like, I want to put a billboard up, like for Vinings Lake right there. And we might do it one day. I don't know. Just when I'm feeling like a little, like we don't have enough controversy, we need more, okay? But I wanted to put a billboard up, and it literally say, Vinings Lake, the church your parents don't want you to attend. I always love it. I'm like, could you imagine? Never in my wildest dreams would I ever thought my parents would be like, I'm concerned about the church you go to. That's a pretty good place to be. If you're worried about the church that your kid goes to, you're fine. You're fine. If that's what you're worried about, you're good. All right. But what were we talking about? Oh, original sin. Okay. All of that to say, I just want you to know, like, it's okay, right? It's okay to read this and like let it move you. Let the story move you. All right. So it has talking animals. It has a magical fruit, like a magical tree. So yeah, if you're reading, like, it feels like a once upon a time. Yeah, I know. All right. Now, if you really want to get into it, scholarship technically says we don't even have historical facts for Solomon. Some scholarship says we do. So a lot of people don't even think any remote history at all even kicks in the narrative until you roughly get around Solomon, maybe David. All right? So that's interesting. When you talk about like actual artifacts, we don't have any evidence of the Exodus. We don't. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It's just saying that's really interesting. I just want you to know I've gotten to a place in my life where I'm 100% okay with that. Because my faith was never hinged on whether or not some book was literal or not. Much, much larger than that. All right? Okay. All of that. I love that we did all of that, and we're just, God. Okay. Genesis 3, Let's just read this. You probably know it. You could probably read it. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from the tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'I may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both them were opened." That's a critical point, by the way. Keep noticing how this writer says their eyes were open. There's some kind of enlightenment, awakening happening right here. "And they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said, 'Where are you?'" Let's just stop there. It's really hard to read this story if you grew up evangelical, because you almost have to unlearn it before you can read it again. Because many of us were conditioned to see this in a particular way. And the particular way that I was raised to see it was they called this the fall. So let me give you a little bit of the evangelical kind of classic interpretation of this. Adam and Eve were born fresh off the assembly line. They were shiny. They were new, perfect, Barbie and Ken. Then Billie Eilish sang a song. And they got sad. And they cried. And the first human beings heard the command of God to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but you can eat from any other tree. And they failed the test. They lost perfection. And because of their decision, every human being who's come after them, because they were two literal people, the very first two people ever made, all right, is what I was told. And every single human who's come after them just biologically inherited the mistake that they made. Okay? Now, let me just read it this way. This is from one of our friends here at Vinings Lake called Derek Webb, all right? Used to be in a band called Cademan's Call, all right? And Derek Webb came not long ago and played some songs for us, and it was great. He has a new album out called The Jesus Hypothesis, and I actually think it's quite amazing. He has one song called God in Drag, which is just an amazing song. And I love, he has one like verse in there that I want to read to you, and it's about this story, Genesis 3. And I love this. He said, "You've heard it said, by the time you're born, it's too late. You don't even get a say. There's free will, but not today, because great-granddad has sealed your fate. When he believed a talking snake, he just took the fruit and ate, and one bad apple's all it takes. When all humanity is at stake, even just a little taste poisons the very root. But I say to you, you're beautiful and free." God, I love that. I love that. Now, here's the question. Where did the idea of original sin emerge? When did it come about? This might surprise you, and it might be good for you to tuck in your chamber. What a terrible analogy. Judaism did not read Genesis 3 as a fall. Judaism did not see human nature as tainted by original sin. Original sin did not fully emerge in the Christian tradition prior to the 4th century. Now, I should preface this for all of the scholars out there that are going to pick me apart. There is some language around original sin from the early church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century. And obviously, there was leverage of proof text from Romans 5, Psalm 51, and Genesis 3. But to be very clear about it, the idea, as we understand it now, did not fully emerge until the 4th century. And it emerged originally from a particular individual named Saint Augustine. All right, so let me be clear about this. The first use of the phrase original sin did not come from the Bible, but it came from the writings of Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine was an individual that lived from 354 to 430 AD. You know his beach? It's in Florida. Augustine believed very firmly that infants, even infants, were damned to an eternal conscious torment in hell. All right. Now, some evangelicals did come along afterward and say, the evangelical movement, and say, actually, that can't be right because that sounds a little harsh. And what kind of a God would, could you imagine having a baby, that baby dying like a week later and then spend eternity in God? Even our ancestors were like, something's not right with that. And so they created this idea of age of accountability, which we've talked about in here, right? So basically they said, actually, you're good. Think about this. Actually, you're all born sinners, but here's the good news. If you die before you're a teenager, you're good. You're good. All right? First of all, I've said this again, but none of us, even the evangelicals, and I, by the way, when I say evangelicals, I'm not picking, that's my people. I need to say that again. That's where I came from. That's who I am. I am who I am because of them. None of them really believed that. They really didn't. None of them actually believed that of which they were teaching. Because if they did, no one would function. No one would function. And I would also say, why would you ever have kids? I'm going to be real clear. We've said this before. If there is an actual hell, literal hell, where people burn forever, you having a kid would be the worst thing you could ever do. Why would you ever populate society? Why would you ever bring a human life into existence only to risk them going there forever? Maybe the reason is because we don't actually believe it. And part of the reason you create things like age of accountability is because you know, intuitively, you know that the epitome of injustice would be to spend eternity in conscious torment. And it flies in the face of a God who is just. But St. Augustine believed infants were damned to hell. St. Augustine wrote his Confessions. I don't know if you do much reading. There are English versions of it now that are helpful, but it's a book called Confessions, and it's his Confessions. And St. Augustine had major influence over our Western Christianity. Like, the reason I'm talking to him about him is because he shaped, by and large, much of what we experience today. He had a large hand in it. And to his credit, I want to say something. If you've never read any of his sermons, phenomenal communicator, all right? Phenomenal. Very persuasive, very charismatic, genius with his talks, all right? He could teach like no one's business. And he shaped and influenced much of our understanding of sin. And so for him, original sin was a no-brainer. He saw it in Adam, believed it was passed down. But I want to say a couple things about St. Augustine that might be helpful for you to know. When you read his book, Confessions, what you'll realize is St. Augustine had a pretty intense sexual addiction, all right? Now, he had a conversion experience, but even after the conversion experience, he writes about the temptation. But prior to that, his story is filled with a lot of shame with his sexual identity. It's filled with a lot of guilt. There are some scholars who say that you could actually pinpoint the purity movement starting with St. Augustine. And what you begin to realize is when you start putting two and two together, it would make sense that St. Augustine would be the first to talk about original sin because he was projecting onto his theology what he was experiencing internally for him. He had a sex addiction with a lot of shame and a lot of guilt, and he didn't know what to do with it. And so to make sense of it, it's like, well, there's not a lot I can do. I'm just born depraved, right? Now, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Okay, you're born depraved. Interesting, because part of owning original sin is being culpable, right? So when I stood up as a 9-year-old and I said, I am a sinner, what am I saying? I'm saying I am responsible, all right? But But if you believe in original sin, the precise meaning of original sin is that we are not personally culpable for it. All right? But it was somehow passed on to us, and all people share in it, but technically it's not my fault, right? So original sin in some ways is a great way to excuse egregious behaviors. And the problem with original sin, and there are many of them, it removes and abdicates responsibility for our own actions. It also promotes just war. We're going to get into that in 2 weeks. We're going to talk about missionaries overseas. We've got to talk about missionaries and one that died not long ago and how he's a martyr, and we've got to have a conversation about that, all right? But St. Augustine was one of the first who preached and practiced just and holy war. That is an oxymoron. I want you to know that, right? There is no such thing. That is the myth of redemptive violence, okay? Are we feeling okay? I'm just spitting it out today. I'm not even asking questions. I'm just coming at it, all right? All right. All right. Also, can we say this about original sin? It diminishes the sacredness of being human, okay? So I'm just saying, where did original sin emerge? It emerged from Augustine. He was a big part. Let me go through a couple of these. It emerged from just the Greco-Roman world in which the first century early Jesus followers came from. Because in kind of that Greco-Roman world, Gnosticism was a big movement, and the Gnostics essentially believed all material matter is evil. That includes you and your flesh and blood. And so a lot of that happened around the same time. You also need to know this, and this is a big one. Original sin in the 4th century emerged when, and what else happened in the 4th century? This is a big moment in church history, when the Christian tradition and the Roman world came together for the first time. And so, just to be clear, original sin is a great way for Rome and the religion of Rome to control the masses. And so we got obsessed with sin because it was easy for the empire and the religion of the day to shame people. And that shame created a solution to the shame, and that solution created a codependency. We have the answer. We have the secret to your problem. But you need to come to us because we're the only ones. We gatekeep the answer here. And turns out, it became very profitable. It became very profitable. And here we are, 2024, in the United States of America. And I don't know if you know this, but evangelicalism is still a money-making machine. And if you don't believe me, just cut on the Christian network on your television, and you will see. Yeah. Original sin's pretty convenient. Now, let's get to the story. Just 2 things right here, and then we'll wind it up. We good? Everybody good? I love that we're going to have lunch after this. There are 2 things that happen at the beginning of the story. We'll get into the details next week. I can't wait. It's going to be fun. Two things that happen. I think it's interesting that the doctrine of original sin, the idea of original sin, is stemmed from a story where 2 people are lied to in the story. And what I'm proposing to you today is that just as Adam and Eve were lied to in the story, maybe you and I have been lied to about the story. What I am proposing to you today is maybe we've misread Genesis 3. I'm also saying to you, we're not the first ones to read it the way we're going to read it. So that might bring some encouragement to you, all right? And I also may discourage some of you like, I knew we were progressive. We're not that progressive, all right? This isn't a brand new idea. It's actually deep in tradition and in history. In fact, you may not know this, much of the Eastern world had no concept of how the Western part of the world read Genesis 3. They scratched their head going, what do you mean a fall? There's no fall in there. Check this out. I don't even know if you know this. Read the story again. Did the word sin ever occur? No. There's no original sin in Genesis 3, and there is no sin, the word, in Genesis 3. You don't actually get the first word sin ever mentioned in the biblical narrative is after Genesis 3 with Cain and Abel. And at its very core, you know what it was? Murder. violence. And so some scholars have said this, and I believe this is true, that actually if you want to talk about original sin, the real original sin is violence. But we don't want to talk about that because our country's addicted to it. Because we believe it can actually bring peace. You realize it didn't work for the Caesars, it's not going to work for us. Yeah. Boy, we're preaching today. Like, I don't even like it. I don't like it. I don't like it. So here's the thing. There's a question that's asked. And this is interesting to me. I saw this just yesterday. I wasn't even going to teach this today. I was going to move it till next week, and then it became too much. But there's this question. And the serpent says, did God really say? Did God really say? Very subtle. Did God really say? So it led me to this thought. Apparently, God had said something. All right, so you rewind it a little bit. What does God say to Adam and Eve? Don't eat from any tree in the garden. Any, by the way. The first was not restriction. It was freedom. Eat from any tree. But don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent comes along and says, did God really say that? So God said something. Then the serpent comes along and says, did God really say that? And then I love this. Eve comes back and says, actually, no, here's what God actually said. And it got my mind thinking, that's what I want to do today. That's what I want to do today. I just want to park there for just a second. Where in this narrative does it say original sin? Where in this narrative does it actually say sin? Maybe we've been reading things into this that just isn't there. So I want to ask the question, tell me, what did God actually say? What, like in this story, what does God actually say? Because nowhere in Genesis 3 does it have God saying, you were born broken, you were born depraved, you were born flawed. No. What it does say is you were actually born, made in the image of God. Because the starting of the text is not in Genesis 3. It actually starts in Genesis 2 and it starts in Genesis 1. And before you ever get to Genesis 3, what you have in Genesis 1, verse 27, so God created humans in his image, in the image of God he created them, and God blessed them, and God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. This is their starting place. This is their essence. This is their home. Nowhere in the story does it say Genesis 3 or Genesis 4, murder is the starting place. It's just not there. And so I propose to you that this very idea of original sin, the repercussions of this one belief are reprehensible. The lie, hear me when I say this is why I'm so passionate about it, because when I talk about original sin, like I am adamant that it must be rejected. It must be rejected. This type of teaching must be rejected. Churches that espouse this must be rejected. I need you to hear me when I say this, because I don't know that we fully understand the repercussions of this type of teaching. And so when I say to you, original sin is not in the Bible, I'm coming from a place where I need you to hear me. I actually think the lie of original sin is the root of all evil. The lie of original sin is the root of all evil. What do you mean, Cody? I mean, take any acts of dehumanization. School shootings. Let's just take school shootings. Take any acts of dehumanization, and what you will find is a human that has been disillusioned about their own essence, and they have been disillusioned to believe they and the people they kill are something other than sacred and divine. And so original sin isn't just some doctrine that's like, oh, you believe it or you don't believe it. No, this is the doctrine. It is the one that, in my opinion, this crafty serpent has done best. Convince the human species that they are their worst atrocities. Because here's what we know. Actions flow from essence. And if you believe, if you raise a generation, if you raise kids to believe they are inherently sinful and flawed, you better believe their actions will match that essence. at some point in their lives. It's the wrong starting place. And this one belief is the root of all evil we see. All evil. Take any act of evil, and I will tell you, when you whittle it down, what you'll find is some individual confused about their own essence and identity, not knowing they're actually deeply sacred beings. Because here's what I want you to know. We don't sin because we are human. You ever heard that before? Well, I'm just human. I was in the gym lifting weights. Did I tell you I lift weights now? I know you can't tell. Have been for 3 months, just working on the golf swing, you know what I mean? But I was in the gym and I had my phone out and this song came on and it was by some guy and he was like, I'm only human. Have you ever heard this song before? And I was like, what a miss. Like, I do all these depraved things because, hey, I'm just only human. And maybe you've heard that before. Well, I'm just a flawed human, all right? First of all, can we flip that? Why are we devaluing? We only devalue the human experience when you don't know your starting point. It's not I'm only human, it's you're human. You're human. We don't sin because we are human. We sin because we forget we are human. I like the way I said that. We don't sin because of our nature. We sin because we have forgotten our nature. And this is why I believe the Christ story, I'm still hooked to it. Because it's one of the few stories, and there are many, but it's one of the few stories that have helped me come to this conclusion. It's the idea that Christ is showing us not just who God is, but who we are. That just as the divine was a son of God, so we too are sons and daughters and children of God. And the reason I'm so passionate about this, and you can probably tell, is because I need to just say this. Until we come to a level of awareness that there is something deeply sacred in all of us, I don't know how much oneness, healing, and wholeness will actually ever begin to happen. And so if you were to ask me, what is Vinings Lake here for? I have one agenda. I want you all and me and our entire city of Atlanta to wake up to the sacredness of our own being. I want you to know it's good to be you. It's always been good to be you. It's always been good to be me. It's always been good to be us. Check this out. It's always been good to be a human. It's always been deeply sacred to be human. Yeah. So let's close here. Y'all have been great today. Let's close here. One critique, and we'll get into it next week, but one critique that I need to mention now because people listen to the audio and then they won't listen to the next one, so it will save some criticism. So, Cody, what do you do with sin? Because it's in the Bible. And we are kind of messed up people. You're right. Here's what I do with sin. First of all, I would say this. Sin is a part of our story. You flip to the New Testament, what you begin to find is when the word salvation is mentioned, you find salvation as liberation from the Roman oppressors, but you also found salvation as being saved from our sin. It's there. What I would tell you is, sin is a part of our story. No one's denying sin. No one's denying the fact that I have wronged many people in my life, and I need to try to right some of those wrongs. No one's denying that. What I am saying is that is not who you are. Sin might be the middle word spoken about you, but it is not the first word spoken about you. And I got even better news. It's not the last word spoken about you. So it's there. And we own our part. But until we get our starting place right and realize we all come from a deeply sacred essence, that's who we are, until we get that right, I'm not so sure our actions will ever become what we want them to become. So maybe we could just say it like this. I'm just playing with some words here. On the fly, it's not in the notes.
Okay.
We are not sinners who sin. I love AA. They meet here on Tuesdays. Lots of my friends, I've had friends that are years sober. Some of you are in this room years sober. I love it. The one thing I have with Bill and his good book, I think they're doing amazing work. I've always had a problem with the way they start. Hi, my name is Cody, and I'm an alcoholic. I just like to flip it a little bit going, maybe our starting place is even wrong in AA. Maybe that isn't, hi, my name is Cody, I'm an alcoholic. Maybe you're not an alcoholic. Maybe it's more like, hey, my name is Cody, and I have abused alcohol. Because one is an action and one is an essence. And maybe we just realize, hey, we're not sinners who sin. I'm just a sinner saved by grace. Wrong. Let's put that out there. Wrong. You are not a sinner saved by grace. You are a saint who has sinned. And there is a big difference. And when I say saint, I'm not talking about just Patrick. Do you know him? Shout out to the man. We are all saints. Do you understand that? When I say saint, I mean sacred. That is our essence. That is our essence. Okay, let's just close here. This is John Philip Newell. It'll be on the screen. Here's a quote for us, and we'll just leave on this, and we're going to have lunch. For those of you that are like, I want more Genesis 3 next Sunday, bring it. All right? Bring it. We're going to be here. It's going to be a good time. We're going to walk through it. All right? John Philip Newell, he comes from the Celtic tradition. One of my favorite writers, speakers of all time. I've begged him to come. He keeps saying no. I'm still asking. All right? One day we'll get him here. But he has the whole Celtic tradition in the Eastern world. We have them to thank for showing us our true sacred essence. All right? They never let go of it. And I'm so grateful for it. But he wrote this: the image of God is at the core of our being. This is the fundamental truth of our inheritance. Everything else that is said about us in the Scriptures must be read in the light of this starting point. And everybody was like, amen. I'm here for that.